we will wait. Maybe more people will arrive meanwhile. So, starting, this is our the last keynote speaker session. Today we are we will close this keynote speaker sessions with Peter Scriver, which is now a huge friend and a colleague. And once more, I would like to highlight that we really we are very thankful to Peter, his generosity of being here, traveling from so far away, for sharing with us your knowledge and wisdom and everything. So Peter is also a consultant of our project. We have learned about a lot with him, and he is the second time that he's in Lisbon, at least among this group of researchers. The first time we have I think it was a remarkable conference in the Overseas Historical Archive with a very small group, but very interested group of researchers. It was, in a different place and a different occasion, but it was really interesting. And I think it was the first time that our team was able to speak with Peter in a presential way. So it was very good for us to could put some questions and some doubts that we had regarding to research. So I have usually I have this writing note. I will follow some of the points was here about Peter Scriver. So Peter is a professor, and we all know that he's an authority in terms of architectural and planning stories of colonial, contemporary South Asia. He has already, Johan Laget said yesterday, he framed some of our theoretical concepts, especially this idea of having idea of a cognitive legacy that explains the work and the approach of the colonial public works departments from the British the British Empire, and especially in India, in colonial India. And Peter also is the founding director of the Center for Asian and Middle Western Architecture at the University of Adelaide in Australia. And so I would ask Peter to come to the stage and starting his conference. And once more, thank you, Peter Scriver, for being with us. As you know, we are very informal here, so we are really happy for once more having you and be able to put you some questions in the end. I'm sure I'm sure your presentation will do it for us. Okay.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah.
No, that's okay. This.
So, yes, indeed, thank you, Anna, and your fabulous team, Filipa, Francesca, Beatriz, Inez, and many others who haven't been named to me, but who are making sure that this conference is running so smoothly and so richly around us. It's been a great 2 days so far. I'd also like to, of course, thank the Fondatio Gulbenkian for this extraordinary venue in which we're all sort of drooling, those of us who care about the good side of brutalist architecture and another era that we're always trying to unpack in our research, understand how we can do such fabulous things in contexts that are not always so fabulous politically and socially. So those are my humble thanks, and it is indeed a great honor to come again. I just loved my first experience of Lisbon and the chance to meet the group in that very intimate, extraordinary situation, an echo of which we had last night when we went to the military archives and saw another place in which the knowledge of the past is being worked on and cared for in an extraordinarily culturally specific way, I think, which was fascinating in its own way to experience. So I'm thankful to the military archives for hosting us last night as well. I'm at risk of blowing my time envelope. I'm going to speak to most of this talk, but I'm going to start by reading some things, so I will do that now before I get too carried away. When by the blessing of providence internal tranquility shall be restored, it is our earnest desire to stimulate the peaceful industry of India, to promote works of public utility and improvement, and to administer its government on behalf of all of our subjects resident therein. Pronounced in 1858, even as British troops were still ruthlessly suppressing the great revolt that had swept across North India the year before, these were the words with which the British Parliament, in the name of Queen Victoria, simultaneously revoked the monopolistic charter of the anarchic East India Company regime and sought to firmly secure the crown jewel of Britain's nascent global empire within its grasp, an ostensible bid for peace through public works. Through the case of British India, this talk will critically consider the production and uses of public works in contexts of conflict and their aftermath. My aim is to trace a thread between the formative post-revolt era in which the British Indian Public Works Department system was substantially developed and institutionalized, and the era of early nation building and development by the newly independent ex-colonial Indian state a century later, that was then just emerging from the profound trauma of the partition of India and Pakistan in the aftermath of the Second World War. What I might characterize as the post-development era of political revisionism that we are currently witnessing in the warlike reworking of the public and political spaces and built fabric of India's national capital, New Delhi, will offer a further salient contemporary context with which to conclude the argument for the longer cognitive historical interpretation that Anna referred to, that I'd like to return to in this talk and try to use to interpret this development. So this paper will draw on the primary historical content as well as the theoretical thesis of original research I conducted over 3 decades ago. So a bit like Johan yesterday, I'm going to look back quite a ways to that work that Anna and others have referred to as being helpful in their work, and try to see whether it still works and whether we can use some of those ideas to look at longer term phenomena that I think are embedded in the ways of thinking and the system of the colonial public works department that was developed in India at that time, how it might affect things even now. But I feel emboldened to do so, particularly on this occasion, to look back over this work, because I've been refreshed by recognizing that so many, in reading the call for papers and participating with Anna and others in reviewing the abstracts for this conference and building this extraordinary program that we're all experiencing in the parallel sessions. I've been really inspired by the return to specific themes by emerging younger scholars from around the world, gathered here with us now, that seem to be gravitating toward some of the cognate issues and objects of study that myself and some others in this room were thinking about long ago and have perhaps continue to think are of some importance. My talk will focus in particular on the production of housing norms and forms as perhaps the most fundamental form of built work in which public means and values may be invested and thereby constructed or destroyed. Let me begin by reflecting on the broader context and implications of my topic, our topic, and our theme, that is arch war. I think I'm supposed to have gone to that image there. Okay. So that map suggested that, in a rather imperial way, I like to think from time to time that working on India is a chance to talk about all the world, certainly to talk about the ideas and the forms, the norms and forms that I've invested a lot of time thinking about in the case of colonial India, how they have emanated around the planet as a sort of a center of the production of colonial culture and practices of the sorts that we are trying to unpack even now in many other trans-colonial contexts, which again is the context in which I first met Anna and Johan in a fantastic session that actually included Samia Henny in her first PhD presentation of her work, or one of the first, a few years ago in Dublin, where we talked about trans-colonial transfers of knowledge and systems, and to what extent research was even beginning to touch on that. I'm happy to see that that's more and more a theme that we deal with. But I want to reflect now on the fact that the second map here sort of emphasizes is that at this stage of my career, I'm also very increasingly conscious, like, again, many of us who've been in the game for some time, that we're still learning. If we're still good researchers, good teachers, we're still reflecting and challenging the basis on which we work. And though I've been teaching for almost 3 decades in Australia, I began life and my career and my training in Canada, so I'm part of 2 settler colonial worlds, one which I didn't so much take for granted, but it was served a more upbeat narrative about when I was a kid, which made me think in a certain way about how lucky perhaps we were, or not think at all about that, just take things for granted. As I teach students in Australia in a stolen land, we begin any public event like this, and typically I begin my history course where I deal with that history by acknowledging the fact that this talk was written on the land of the Kaurna people, who are the indigenous peoples of the Adelaide Plains, where I teach and work, and where the University of Adelaide long ago appropriated its patch of land along with the city around it to build a neo-European society on that place. I acknowledge their different knowledge systems and their continuing right to that unceded land. I now would like to reflect on, through the image I'm showing you here, on a little fragment of that history. That there's a street named Frome Road which bounds my university campus, which not long after I came to settle in Adelaide in the 1990s, I stumbled on a fact that this name was named after a lieutenant, one of a military character named E.C. Frome, Edward Frome, whose materials, who was the surveyor general, or the second surveyor general of that newly established colony, established in 1836, who has his papers in the art gallery next door. And I take my students to look at that at the beginning of my course every year, to see how Europeans visualize this place, to see what documentation and such there is in evidence of the colonization of that space, and how we need to understand its multiple layers of understanding that I endeavor to teach my students about in the course. One of the documents we may look at is this journal of Frome, which, if you've read the caption there, which is translating what he's written as the explanation for the image, he was a military man making a reconnaissance here to go and check out some restless natives who had apparently done some mischief with some mariners. And after documenting their settlement, making some good anthropological record of one of the very few we have of Aboriginal settlement, he said, and I burned the buggers' homes down, and so they will never come back. To punish them for not being too welcoming to these foreigners who came upon their shores. So it's my first little lesson in the directness between the violence of colonial appropriation and the fundamental question of dwelling. And in this case, also that almost ignorance of what was there, in fact, the denial in the case of Australia that there was anything there, which legally, as you may know, was the justification for the colonial project in the first place, a legal statute saying it was empty land. These people were nomads. But here, this military record acknowledges that they were settled on that spot, and they will not settle there anymore because he's destroyed their homes. Now, this guy is interesting because, and it caught my interest before I found that journal and looked in more closely, because I learned through some other scholarship by retired Royal Engineers in England who were telling the grand narrative of what the Royal Engineers and their forebearers had done across the planet in the age of empire to build, this wonderful thing. And it turns out that Lieutenant Frome began his career where I began my career in Canada. Having left England with his basic training, he was sent, to the bottom of the rung. Go to that God-forbidden frozen place, which interestingly, when the summer was also full of malaria, which is what's the big problem. In the image you see on the left, he was carving the Rideau Canal, which was a strategic canal that connected the St. Lawrence River to the Ottawa River, and the site of which is today Ottawa, the capital of the country. But the reason Ottawa is there, it was sort of removed from those nasty Americans who had recently rebelled against the empire and who are now allied with the French. And this was a strategic military work to give a backdoor route from the new settlements in Upper Canada and Toronto around to Montreal by way of what was called Bytown, the name of the Colonel By who's standing there in the red coat. The adjutant, the younger one who's overseeing the works, is probably someone like Lieutenant Frome, who was then deputed to Adelaide in the next decade to become the second Surveyor General, succeeding Colonel William Light, who laid out the rather remarkable plan of Adelaide, if anyone's looked at it, which is a fascinating example, a rather perfect and extraordinary example of a colonial settlement that actually took. Here his job was also demonstrating his artistic ability to depict landscape with accuracy and some care for the character of the land. It's a very accurate depiction of what is the first major road. It's now the highway to Melbourne that comes up out of the Adelaide Plains through the hills that bound it. He's just built the first road there. He's documenting his first public work. And he was also responsible for completing the survey, which took the city out into the countryside and claimed the next great tranche of land to make it good, make it productive, begin to cultivate it with introduced crops and make it wealthy. So that preamble is to say that those are all, wonderful, peaceable works, but of course they're part and parcel with the violence of appropriation, of transformation, of denial and erasure that we all understand very well from our casework in many other parts of the globe. I want to return now to the main argument and the much more overt and coarse violence with which the British India we know was really cemented. Of course, the British were there in competition, commercial and otherwise, with other European powers on and off for 3 centuries prior to this time. But this is the moment when they almost lose the game and they suppress a major popular revolt against the former company regime and transform it into a formal colonial project with proper governance and commitment of resources. I'm going to return to my script at this point and explain a bit more. So India's central place in the British Empire was secured by violence of another order, as I've just said. The government of India by the English resembles that of the provinces of Rome in being virtually despotic. As one colonial commentator of the time argued, in both cases, whatever may have been done for the people, nothing was or is done by the people. To end that quote. This rather un-English state of affairs stemmed from the essential military composition and disposition of the Anglo-Indian society, which is the point I want to develop in the next part of this talk. And here's another quote from that same author who was publishing early in the 1910s in sort of late reflection upon the high point of the empire and what lay before it in the early 20th century when it wasn't yet clear whether they were staying or going. And I quote again, "The traveler from peaceful England feels himself surrounded by an atmosphere of gunpowder all the time he stays in India." This would be echoed in the language with which colonial space and the built environment that contained it had come to be described. As the late Anthony King taught me as one of my most significant advisors in my own work, as well as many others in the work, perhaps directly, hopefully some of you also had a chance to know him personally, but certainly through his seminal work. So he taught us all to observe in his early work on colonial urban development in British India, the terms peculiar to the built environment produced by colonialism, cantonment, civil lines, compound, bungalow, circuit house, veranda, go-down, gymkhana, dock, coolie, etc., were almost all derived from the nomenclature of militarized occupation. Notwithstanding the many political projects of decolonization, he also reminded us how normalized such terms and forms had continued to be in the postmodern era. But there were other less problematic comparisons between the nascent British Empire and that of the Romans, with which colonial officials could flatter themselves without scruples. Most significantly, the British perceived themselves to be like the Romans in their pragmatism, turning knowledge and technique to concrete problems such as engineering. And here I was supposed to be showing you this image all the time I was talking about the gunpowder, but I guess the previous image probably put it in your nose as well. But here the contrast between the violence and then the sort of the order and system of an engineer, of a military engineering point of view. The triumphant works of British engineers, and so I think, sorry, I'm supposed to advance now, yes, to this particular work. The triumphant works of British engineers in India had embodied the knowledge and power of the conquering civilization, both explicitly and reassuringly from an ethical standpoint, or at least some might wanted to have believed. While the shock of the mutiny, as the British military people understood the revolt of 1857, as most of you would probably know, that was a mutiny within the native Indian conscript ranks of the British East India Company Army that had turned against their officers and tried to overturn the regime. While the shock of the mutiny had lingered, the baldly militaristic affinity with Rome could hold sway in the imagination of the British public temporarily, captivated by the violence and pathos of the current Indian affairs. And that particular event was one of the first widely published and fairly rapidly published events. We were beginning to have telegraph connections all the way from India, not quite, but most of the links had been closed by that time. And in a relatively short time, images, the first photographic images, as you saw, and very sophisticated photolithographic techniques through public press were beginning to keep a news-hungry public back in England aware of what was going on and was manipulating, of course, their understanding of the events. So this could hold sway on the British public, and then the violence and the pathos of current affairs. Meanwhile, to those troubled by the contradictions such an imperial vision presented for a nation that regarded its belief in liberty as its principal virtue, and here I'm talking about that England, that parliamentary England that we talk about, it could be argued that British conquest had brought progress to India of a distinctly practical sort. And here I'll just remind you about the other sorts of public works that testimonial by Queen Victoria in 1858 was sort of referring to, and the buildings that began to be produced in the next 10 years. Of course, public buildings, hospitals, all in the grand sort of public modern style of neo-Gothic, which we associate with the metropole at that time. And then most famously, both factually and a subject of many myths as well, the railway system that was, of course, ultimately this great public asset, but was first and foremost the most obvious and important strategic military asset as well in securing this very large subcontinent, and had already proved itself in the revolt, and that the first semi-completed sections of the railway system had proved very instrumental in suppressing that revolt. As the imperial ideology matured, however, this notion of progressive intervention was superseded by a more sustainable and essentially conservative ideal of the imperial destiny of Britain. And here I quote again, to guarantee order and stability in a world of jostling and expansionist nations driven by Machiavellian desires. So again, the British colonial officials in this time are reflecting at the high point of this thing, we're thinking, we're better than the rest of those lots. We do good works. We're modest. We are focused on improvement, etc. Okay, I'm going to stop reading now and pick up the pace for a while so that we don't run short of time. Are we already at the 30-minute mark? 15 minutes. Okay, that's very good news. Okay, so we've talked about public works, and those of you who know my work, it's largely about, the early work is largely about the invention, the production, the establishment of a public works department system in colonial India in this period, and what it was made of. I've emphasized the fact that it was first and foremost provoked or ratified in its preliminary establishment in the early 1850s. Its value was demonstrated in this military situation in 57, 58, and then the most obvious strategic need that, in addition to completing the railway system, was making sure that large numbers of European troops, as you see here, could thrive, or at least survive and be in fighting fitness in this tropical climate to suppress the next unrest and to make sure that the grip was firm indeed. So the business architecturally of rethinking the infrastructure of the military was a major part of this work of the Public Works Department, which was already ramifying into various branches, the military works, the railway works, civil works, justice works, etc., all of which had their sub-departments. Dealing with public health, and those of you, I apologize, who were in the DINÂMIA'CET-Iscte conference a few weeks ago in Singapore will have heard me speak in more detail about this aspect of the argument. Making an architecture that, of course, responded to climate but dealt very specifically with disease and the heightened awareness simultaneously at that time in the metropolitan situation of the need for sanitary reform. These things come together in challenging and upgrading and or at least proposing that much of the way things were being built in India should be changed with scientific improvement. What the longer story of that, and importantly so, is that not so much gets changed in any radically obvious way. There was a tradition that we'll see images of in a moment that, of course, had evolved in that context over at least a couple of centuries of European occupation and inhabitation in the region that was being adapted, upgraded, challenged, tested, but not necessarily replaced by an entirely new way of doing things. And these images are showing you some of the classic barrack forms that become standardized from this point forward into standard plans that were then to be replicated with fairly rigorous precision thereafter in the military works branch, including double-story barracks here that were meant to remove the soldiers from the malarious, bad-smelling ground air and help them be healthier higher up, of course, without yet knowing that the mosquitoes were the problem. On the ground, it's also a way of classifying, in an obvious way within a military organization, rank and privilege, where lesser grunts live in dormitories, non-commissioned officers begin to have a space for themselves, gazetted officers, etc., generals would have grander and grander floor plates and relative abodes that are made for them and standardized and that they expect to be promoted to. What I want to begin segue in the next few images is how, as you saw, the last image on the right was not a military building but a civil hospital, and it didn't look in section or otherwise, particularly, sorry, wrong image, particularly different from the standardized military junior officers or married officers quarters that you see there on the left. The basic configuration, dealing with the climate, dealing with the sort of transformation of the bungalow into ranks and files of buildings becomes quite typical and translatable to the civil sector. And here this wonderful drawing, which I think got into circulation first through King's work, which we've all seen before, just emphasizes how this is a total design exercise. The house, the home, the vestments, the hat, of course, looks very much like the section of the buildings. And the argument here is that the military man on the right, is no different than the civil man on the left. They're all servants of the project, and they ought to be dressed appropriately. King has long ago told us the story of bungalow. This is how it gets translated into the standards that are now becoming normative by the later 19th century. Okay, I've reached my 2/3 point, so I'm going to really race now. And this drawing, I think, that I also shared in my last talk here, which I always come back to as the sort of the most fundamental, obscure thing that I found in one of those hallelujah moments in my work in the archives, was just a drawing that took that most basic section and drew it and differentiated through material how that could be a discerning differentiation of class. The native government servants of lowly pay wage, gets a dirt floor. The Eurasian, that is mixed race servant who's somewhere literally by their racial pedigree in the middle ranking of race, gets a chunam floor, a polished, harder cement-like floor, and a slightly better truss work in the ceiling, but no difference in space. Translation of these, again, here in the example of railways, into a civil reality, but recognizing that everyone in the system is in service somehow of the project, the colonial project. The railway system here, even a private railway or the state railway systems that were developed in collaboration with the railway branches of the Public Works Department, translate that same insidious logic of space and finish and most basic of details to differentiate between different pay grades, different grades. These are for linesmen, the people who keep the grade in check on the railway and have to live along the line and work on maintaining the track every day. But their foremen, of course, get a better space, and the boss foreman gets an even better one. And architecture, in the most basic way, seems to differentiate what that means. So we know this landscape, the military on the right, the civil on the left. The point I want to drive home here, again, is well known to us all, but it resonates with, say, the session on heterotopias yesterday that I heard several fascinating papers in. The military space is full of these other places that are particularly designed, as we've seen, for a particular purpose, to stand outside the norms of what is there in the native city, the aggregated traditional place. It's disaggregated in the modern colonial space into these specific purposes. But of course, it is on the civil side as well. The civil lines include some line-like layouts, but is more often than not these enclaves, these heterotopias for hospital or prison or college purposes up on the right, an elite college, for a race course, etc. All of these things. Okay, now I'm going to race to the latter part of my argument. This was the world that was built. These were the people, and to pick up on Johan's, wonderful. What is the word I'm looking for? Articulation of the many layers and angles methodologically into which we need to unpack these phenomena. We need to, of course, know what the Public Works Department was. I've implied that it was predominantly military engineers. There they are up on the left, but of course it wasn't just that. And by the high point, it's a gang of architects who are trying to jostle for space within there. It's a gang of civil engineers who are very different in their cultural subclass or sub-mentality, and as innovators, as progressives who really are pushing against the conservativeness of the militaries. And there's laborers, there's craftsmen, there's artisans, and overseers of many sorts, which crosses the color line as well. How they work themselves out in space, we'll have to discuss another time, but here's a proposition of a Bourdieuian sort of field diagram that suggests that they occupy different positions or stances relative to a space of production. The aesthetes who are there criticize that what we have as a lost opportunity. The British producing this ersatz, banal, extruded, undistinguishable form of architecture that is a courthouse one day, a bungalow the next, a barracks the next, without much distinction. The father of Rudyard Kipling famously was one of the most important champions in India of that essentially what became the arts and crafts position. I want to share with you another short bit of text here, though, that just emphasizes the crux of this thing, and then I'm really going to have to race. By the end of its first half century of operation as a ubiquitous government agency for physical planning and construction in British India, as well as many of the princely states, the Public Works Department had gone a long way toward reorganizing the built fabric and spatial patterns with which a modern Indian society was already emerging in the procedural and legal frameworks through which the departmental system operated. It had also begun to rationalize the cultural norms to which these new built forms and spaces were configured. Yet, for the increasingly conflicted colonizers themselves, the earnest, almost naive positivism of their technical investment in the colonial arena served at least as much as a symbolic representation of the ideals of modernity for which they presumed to stand apart and above their colonial subjects, as it did to engineer actual social change. As one eminent member of the engineering fraternity later defended the utilitarian approach to the design of the bread and butter buildings produced by the Public Works Department, and now I quote, "If there are cheap and ugly box-like buildings, we have to remember that there is another aspect to the case. If the British had acted like the Moguls, they would have built great cathedrals and other monuments to their glory at the cost of the blood and tears of a conquered people. But they worshipped in cheap, barn-like churches. They lived in cheap houses and worked in cheap offices. And for the benefit of the people, they spent money in other ways." End of quote. Such claims for the selfless practicality of the colonial regime and its accommodation further illustrate the prevailing ethos in which the built environment of modern India had begun to be framed over the course of the 19th century. But there was ample scope yet for the paradoxes and contradictions of colonial modernity to find expression in the turn to a more rhetorical approach to architectural and urban design that was to characterize the final decades of colonial rule in the early 20th century. What the PWD's critics reviled, and we saw in a moment ago the case of Kipling, or their champions like this Lionel Jacob, whose quotation I just read, praise in terms of their ethical stance, was a propensity to work with the resources at hand within the framework of conventional forms and patterns of use. And these were heuristic tactics, a mode of professional reasoning in action characteristic of a military engineer that might be better described as critical pragmatism rather than rote conservatism. By contrast to the manner of parametrically optimal design solutions occasionally sent out by metropolitan experts and as often ignored, these merely sufficed to invoke the apposite term coined by the decision theorist Herbert Simon some many years ago. As Simon observed, systems do not in general optimize, but nevertheless adapt well enough to function by satisfying a limited but sufficient number of criteria. Applying this concept to design thinking, satisficing solutions can be recognized as that surprisingly numerous case of outcomes that are, quote, inelegant, incomplete, impermanent, inexpensive, and just barely good enough to work, yet all in all, adequate to the task, end of quote. As military engineers engaged in peacetime planning and construction in India through the agency of the colonial civil technocracy, the engineer officers of the Public Works Department were, in a sense, engaging tactically with the engineering challenges of the enemy terrain, but through non-military means. They were not concerned with permanent solutions, so much as with adequate adaptive responses to complicated sets of interdependent criteria. But this was also a rationale limited by the disciplinary self-consciousness of military engineers operating, as we saw, in a closed market of competing professional services. Now, I've already blown my time envelope, but I wanted to just take you through that promised second thing, and Inez is giving me the thumbs up that I was allowed to do that. So at the expense of questions, I just want to show you, or at least test, that old work of mine, and that is essentially the argument of my earliest major work on this topic, dusted off, represented in the context of our arch war. But I want to take us to the post-colonial moment and to the present very quickly in another 4 or 5 minutes, if you'll indulge just the images. Of course, this was the nation-building moment. 47 was India's moment of independence. Right after Second World War, we typically talk about it in our scholarship as that post-war moment when it, among others, was one of the major cases. But of course, that same moment, or because of that moment, was really the real trauma was not the war, and the long trauma of colonization was brought to a very explicit and extraordinarily violent head with that insidious and much repeated colonial get out and dust your hands of the business approach that was taken in India first of all, and then in other places like Cyprus and Palestine and such subsequently, of partitioning the problem, permanently dividing those that you had manipulated through division all along. So the settlement crisis of North India in particular, and here the case of Delhi was extraordinary, literally millions of displaced persons, very comparable, if not equal in numbers, to the displacement of peoples in Europe in the same moment. This was a map I found, just was able to take off the internet just the other day. It wasn't there before, somehow the work's been done, but from the archive showing in that period of time the difference, the escalation in the buildings of New Delhi in that period of resettling these, in this case, displaced Sikhs and Hindus who had come across from the former Pakistan and vice versa, same things happening in Karachi and Lahore. What I want to, the storyline here is that we now, the Brits are leaving, have left. The vacuum within the Public Works Department, which is still very much there, is that the senior draftsmen, who we saw in the picture in the background of the white guys who were in the architectural office, step up and are now the chief architects. In the 10 years or so before the Brits left, they'd been given a chance to, by benevolent bosses who said, you'll never get promoted to my rank, but why don't you go and lead in the development, the Delhi Improvement Trust, go and work in these other areas and fill in some of the gaps, which is what they had been doing, cutting their teeth. And by the mid-1950s, this was the piece of that, almost all of the fabric you saw before that was actually directly under the control of the Public Works Department. All that building stock was their responsibility. Those guys had been working since the 1920s in filling the gaps and building the bungalows, the bread and butter, the flesh on the bones of Lutchen's plan with highly classified, highly stratified accommodation like this, including housing for themselves. It would look like this. And the last British designed housing in the mid-40s during the wartime, which was built in the lower edge of Lutchen's Delhi, that was this. Immediately after across the tracks and the drain, we see the servants' quarters being built and the process of filling in gaps, beginning to reflect this urge, of course, to move forward with a new architectural language, but also working with the making do with the situation and the needs and the amount of knowledge and the means to greatly inflate the capacity of the city to hold this new bureaucratic class of Indian senior bureaucrats who begin to live in accommodation like this. And then we see, of course, town and the neighborhood unit ideas, modernist ideas, that some of these draftsmen who've now gone to Liverpool and topped up their training with an RIBA accredited degree in urban planning, such are now shaping really quite wonderful garden city enclaves like this one called Kakanagar. On the lower side, the socioeconomic side, we see the beginning of the more overt modernist message coming through with the work of the Public Works Department, dealing with lower cost or lower grade public accommodation for so-called peons, a Portuguese term still used very much in India, and middle-ranking government officers who begin to get housed in accommodation like this, aggregating to higher and higher scale, etc. So this is the way in which, again, the architect in this case, trained with Gropius and such, begins to begin those more overt impact of pure modernism by the mid-60s. It's interesting to look at now famous people like Doshi, who also begin by emulating late 19th century railway workers' quarters. We associate his work with core, but we recognize that that's already part of the tradition of India, not necessarily from North Africa, but from India itself, that translates into fascinating experiments with housing in and outside the Public Works Department, but shaped, I argue, heavily by that sort of socialized but contextualized, getting the job done, making do with the ideas and the means of the time. Now, let's finish, and I'm seriously over time now, with the very recent past and the here and now. Many of you will be aware that thinking people in the academic world are often, talk carefully about the government and society in India today. It's an example of many states of political culture in our world today that have definitely lurched to the right, and proudly so, in democratic societies where majorities are taking more populistic control of the storyline and rethinking the storyline. So I want to finish by looking at what the Public Works Department is doing in India today, in Delhi, in the service of the government of the day, with respect to what is often argued from the current regime's point of view as completing the decolonization process. If what we saw as the modernism before still obviously carried forward many of those fundamental principles of colonial stratification and classification of space and society that were integral to the colonial discussions of brutalist architecture in recent years. At risk, SOS brutalism, that sort of discussion. This building was remarkable. It was built as an exhibition structure for the trade fair facility in Delhi. It's a permanent exhibition structure to house recurring temporary shows. But it was built in 1972-73 literally by hand. And this is what's most remarkable. It was the largest concrete space structure on the planet, largely recognized world over as a phenomenon of engineering and architectural achievement in terms of its not sort of necessarily rational or expected mode of fabrication. It was demolished as an embarrassment by the current government, saying it's not world class. We can do better. We need a world class trade fair, and so they're building one which, frankly, is unremarkable. Same sort of arguments they've been making about demolishing all of that fabric we saw coming into being in the 50s and 60s. And here it is being demolished at the end of the first term that this government is in power. We began with that image by a famous photographer who happens to be the son of the man who designed that unit that was replicated all across India as really kind of the essential dwelling of the modern Indian government servant. The modern man of India was that house type, and now that is being erased and being replaced by what the market is producing on the right on literally the same sites. Ines is now getting worried. I'm in my last couple of images here. So moving from housing to again the biggest football or elephant in the room at the moment, which is the redesigning of Lachin's Delhi, or what is said in alarming terms is the demolition of all of that colonial heritage and everything else. In fact, what the government is doing is wants to demolish everything that its predecessors since independence built in a arguably haphazard way, in a making-do way, in that Public Works Department way that I was suggesting was the way they got things done, which you're seeing here. All of that's slated to be demolished, and replaced by what you see here in the architect's view. Of course, this is the Rajpath, the imperial Kingsway that was designed to orchestrate the grand political axis of British colonial India, imperial India, which very importantly was first used in the most memorable way for the celebration of Mahatma Gandhi in his funeral. That's his funeral procession shortly after independence, but which continues to be used every year to celebrate the Republic with a reproduction in ever greater and grander and more modern militaristic way of the power of the Imperial British Empire, now the imperialistic Indian Republic. But this is the image of what they want to replace it with, and they are in fact replacing it with. And the final, you had an impression of that. What I'm arguing here is that it's a public-private partnership. It's meant to be world-class. It's the neoliberal / neoconservative redoing or doing better of the capital project in that, kind of ersatz, extremely competent but absolutely unremarkable way. Now the argument is this is doing better. This is completing the project and doing it, in a really professional way. It's being done with a super professional firm. I know the architect well. It's an in-house practice. It has everything in-house. It's almost like a private public works department, and it's doing it hand in glove with the current central public works department, with the total blessing of the powers that be. Now their argument is that that's overcoming that higgledy-piggledy mess that was never overcome, and this is the final decolonial statement. It's not erasing the British, but it's appropriating the political buildings of Baker to become a museum rather than the secretariat of the government, and they're building new buildings for that. So the urge here, I would suggest, is to move away from making do, from satisficing, to having the parametrically complete, the final solution to what a decolonized state should be. But I question, or I leave it to you for discussion perhaps, because now we really must do that, whether that is decolonizing or in fact an indication that what I'm talking about is even more deep set than we might think, and is perhaps never to be overcome, that we always live arguably perhaps in a state of impermanence, and perhaps appropriately so that we can try new things. I'll leave it there, and I thank you for your indulgence and having, overstepped my 45 minutes by a bit. Thank you.
Hello, Peter. Good morning. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Nuno from DINÂMIA'CET-Iscte. So actually, your presentation picked up me for two questions, but I will just say the two, and then if you want, just pick one. Regarding your prologue in Australia, I remind me of a book that I read 2 decades ago, I think, from Bruce Chatwin, the songlines. And if I remember well, this book describes space more in a dynamic way, since the inhabitants looked at space in a movement. So they describe the space by moving themselves, by moving the bodies from one point to the other. And I think that's quite interesting, and the confrontation regarding the fixed space. So that, I think, could be one question. I think how this works. So how can we look at space in a dynamic way more than a fixed settlement space. And the other question is regarding this last Indian approach. It's very simple. It's so what we are doing here is some sort of revision of colonialism and post-colonialism. And my question is, so what could we do differently if we could do it in a first step again? So what could we do if, when we reach these places, if we have a second opportunity? And without picking up Mark Twain's text, the blessings of civilization to this territory. So what should we do differently right now? Thank you.
Okay, well, do you want, shall I respond directly? Yeah, all right. Or maybe if there's time for a couple of questions. Oh, all right. Well, I'll try to do that. Yes, well, the song lines by Chatwin, I certainly read that, as perhaps many people in the room did, shortly before I moved to Australia, almost 3 decades ago, and it was something I've often reflected on, and it's interesting. Perhaps not surprisingly, this British author's views aren't that important from an Australian point of view, or not referred to so often. But I think that observation that he was infatuated with or impressed with, and wrote that rather evocative story around, was indeed about the idea of sort of singing. That's what the song is. They're just sort of singing the land, which is it's an idea of what it means, and how you play it, a bit like you play a piece of music by following the notes across the space of the clefts of music, or in this case of the landscape, and experiencing it as an understanding in motion. It's a wonderful suggestion. So I guess the question latent in that observation, or that recapitulation of that idea, is, could there be a more dynamic way of understanding and being in space? And I think that was certainly the thing I was opposing by reminding you how the maps of our implantation upon colonial landscapes, with the translation of colonial town plans and colonial regimes of property and fence building, property delineation, fixed those things. And that, in terms of Australian popular culture and the readiness, in a sort of shockingly delayed way there, of serious new literary works, new TV miniseries and such, actually looking with some critical acuity at this past, are constantly bringing our attention to is the pounding in of the fence posts, the imposition of these lines of division and ownership and separation, and in a sense, driving the stake into the heart of this living, dynamic kind of land that our Aboriginal peoples, if we listen to them, are constantly telling us is alive, and telling us things that won't be bounded by these understandings of what land is, what country is. So I think that's a very important idea for an audience like this to consider. Are there other ways of being dynamic and nimble in our understanding of habitation? I was talking with Alessandro yesterday, some reflections upon some ideas I think he gave us at the beginning to talk about in that way, and some of the projects which challenge the question of permanence, particularly through the lens of the experience of living for generations in refugee camps in some case intentionally impermanent way, in order to make the political point that we shall not be displaced from our permanent place. But maybe there's some learning from the long time in a refugee camp that maybe you can never go back, or should never go back to that place of a kind of a blood and soil relationship with one patch of land where that is your permanent place and no one else's. I think that's the dilemma of our world today, and something for us architects to think about. The second point, well, maybe that's the beginning of my answer to the second point. Is there another way of decolonizing that, isn't the revisionist, knock it down and build it in a different way, or build it in a more homogenized way, or whatever, and try to believe that that's the best way? I don't think I know. I think my job is to keep looking at the evidence and keep being critical. That is, keep being conscious that we shouldn't take it for what it is, but we should do, as I always say about history, and as Inez mentioned yesterday about the archive, or whatever, that we should always remember to look at it today and ask what questions we're putting to that evidence for what we might do tomorrow, rather than for saying, well, that's the way it was, and therefore that's the way it is. I don't think I believe that at all. So how would, if I was in practice, deal with that dilemma? It's interesting because I know the architect. He's actually a very sophisticated person, but his practice is thriving under this regime. Is he Albert Speer? Was Albert Speer a bad guy? Yeah, well, he spent a lot of time thinking about that and sharing some of those ideas, and we have things to learn from that. Maybe if there's still time, but maybe there isn't. I know it's time for coffee. And, oh my gosh, there's no time. No. It's time for coffee, and we're already 20 minutes. I can't believe it's that late. No. Yeah.
Thank you.